When you're exercising in hot but dry environment, basically what you're gonna do, your blood is going to move towards your extremities, your legs or your arms, for example, and that extra blood will help dissipate the heat that you have in your body, right? How? By sweating and transferring that heat to your sweat, and once the sweat evaporates, your temperature drops.
Hi, Lilia. It's my pleasure to have you in Evidence Strong Show. If you could briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, Alex. Thank you for inviting me. Well, as you just said, my name is Lilia Convit. I am originally from Venezuela. I started my career as a sports dietitian, and then once I moved to Australia, that evolved a little bit into exercise and sports science, and now I'm basically doing some research in that area. So a little bit of everything, but very rewarding. Yeah, so now at the moment I am focusing on female research. So basically it's mostly physiological differences once you apply acute heat mitigation strategies, mostly endurance athletes. But again, this is an area of research that can be translated to different realms.
Yeah, we are both in Australia. Australia is hot in summer. We are just on the verge of summer. How about we start with discussing why exercising in heat can be a problem?
Okay. Yeah, so basically when we are exercising in the heat, there are a few things that happen. And this not only happen when we're exercising, it happens on day-to-day living, right? The hotter it gets, our core temperature and even also the skin temperature rises as well. So when there is a rise in core body temperature, heart rate also increases. And then we have issues with the perceived exertion of an activity. We also have issues with the thermal sensation of the environment. And at the end of the day, all these variables together will affect performance or will exacerbate fatigue as well. So either or, like it will affect directly or will make you feel a little bit more fatigue. And obviously, like we won't be able to perform at our best, regardless of the exercise that we're conducting. This is particularly important when we are exercising for long periods of time and when we don't have available breaks. Okay, so if you have a cooling break, for example, or if you do certain reps or exercises and then you stop, maybe it won't be as, let's call it, distressing. But if it is a prolonged exercise like a marathon or a multi-day event, or the opposite, multi-event days, this is what's going on. So yeah, it's particularly important. If this happens in the long term, if we have an increase in core body temperature, an increasing in skin temperature, so on and so forth, we are also more susceptible to have heat diseases like heat stroke or collapses, etc., etc. So that's why it is important to keep in mind that exercising in the heat is not the same as exercising in temperate temperatures.
Okay, so what would you say to people who would say, oh, that's all good, we are humans, we adapt, we can sweat, and therefore we can mitigate the heat?
Yes, that's totally true. Basically, sweat is the main way for us to dissipate the heat. But depending on the ambient temperature and the humidity that we are exposing our bodies to, sweat can be compromised. So if we are in an environment in which it is very hot and it's also humid, the opportunity to evaporate the sweat from the skin is limited. So instead of cooling down by sweating, there is a point in which you don't sweat anymore. You have this sweat on top of your skin, but it doesn't cool you down. You are just sticky and it doesn't help you with cooling. And that's the issue why, depending on the exercise environment or the conditions we may require other strategies. So for example, the use of fans, as you just mentioned before, or maybe the acute heat mitigation strategies that I'm working with. So ice vest or the use of ice slurries, cold towels, so on and so forth. Because those things help you cool down and also helps you to evaporate that sweat that cools you down.
Could you explain the heat and humidity relationship and the sweating, how it exactly works?
Well, so yeah, basically that's more or less what I was saying before. When you are in a hot environment but humidity is not high, you can easily dissipate your internal temperature towards like using the skin as a medium to do that, right? So when you're exercising in hot but dry environment, basically what you're going to do, your blood is going to move towards your extremities, your legs or your arms, for example, and that extra blood will help dissipate the heat that you have in your body, right? How? By sweating and transferring that heat to your sweat, and once the sweat evaporates, your temperature drops. When the temperature is hot, but the humidity is high, you can evaporate that sweat the same way. So basically, your body needs to be hotter than the environment for that to happen. If the environment is too hot, you can't transfer that energy, let's say, from your body to the environment, which is what we call uncompensable heat. Basically, that's what happens. When you are in a humid environment, it doesn't work the same way. So thermoregulation is a little bit, affected, let's say. And we need to use other types of strategies to help us cool down.
So one factor is the temperature. The higher the temperature, the harder it is because the difference between body temperature and the outside temperature is higher. But another thing is the amount of water in the air, so humidity. There is a point where the body is not able to cool down because the humidity is high enough so we cannot evaporate the sweat from the skin.
There is also a third component, which is also the airflow. So if you have airflow, definitely you will be able to dissipate that heat and transfer the heat to the environment, right? And evaporate that sweat, etc., etc. But if you don't have airflow, the same happens. So it's like a bubble. Think about it as a bubble. If the temperature is concentrated around you and the humidity is concentrated around you, you can't just let that extra heat out of your body, which makes, as I said, things complicated. One of the issues with prolonged exercise and affects also someone like in the gym or competing, let's say a CrossFitter, is the lack of fluid replenishment. So yes, you get dehydrated obviously because you're exercising, but what happens in long events is that most of the time the sweat rate is way higher than the amount of liquid that you can put in. And then during the event, we're talking about events that can go up to 12 hours sometimes. You have 2 hours event, 4, 6, 12 multi-day events. Mm-hmm. If you don't manage properly, you tend to have 8% or more of dehydration. And the definition of dehydration is more than 2%. So imagine like the massive gap of fluid that is not being consumed and how that affects physiologically the body without taking into consideration all other aspects like the increase in body temperature. But it's basically like having a pot. Like if you're trying to heat the water in a pot and you have a little pot and you have a big pot, the little pot will boil way quicker than if you have a bigger pot. So it's exactly the same thing. If you have more water in your body because you are being rehydrating properly, then that core temperature that is a little bit more dangerous, let's say, to maintain in the long term will be harder to reach than if you have a little pot and you're dehydrated. So basically, that's more or less what's happening.
Okay, so we know that the exercising in heat may be problematic. We went through the physiological things that are happening. Dehydration will make it worse. No airflow will make it worse. Sun exposure. Oh, I asked about sun exposure.
Oh, yes. So sun exposure, basically what it does, it increases your core body temperature or your skin temperature. So regardless of how long the exposure it is, that not only affects your core body temperature and your internal heating, but also dehydrates you because you're sweating more. So at the end of the day, a mix of all these conditions will compromise your performance. Let's say that imagine when you go to the beach and you get sunburned. If you get sunburned and then the day after you want to go to the gym, for example, and exercise a little bit more, does it feel right or it's difficult for you to dissipate? It's difficult because you're already hot, like your skin is already hotter than usual. So again, sun, regardless of if it's affecting you like externally, let's say your skin, or if it's just hot, but not necessarily sunny, but it's hot and affects your internal temperature, at the end of the day, that will compromise your thermoregulation more, and especially in long duration events.
Excellent. So we have clarity on that. Now, are there any differences, I'm asking into your expertise now, are there any differences between females and males in the danger of the heat?
Okay, so this is a very interesting question. There are definitely wide of different opinions, but I will try to focus as much as I can in the physiology. Okay, so one of the first things that we need to take into account is that females tend to have a higher fat percentage than males most of the time. So when that happens, you are basically having like an insulating layer around your muscles that will difficult the heat dissipation. That's one of the things that happens most of the time with females. Another, like on the other hand, males tend to have more muscle mass or more lean mass, which means that this muscle that is metabolically active will generate more heat. So if you think about it, it's like, well, these ones can't dissipate easily, but these ones are generating more heat. So is there an actual difference, or they just behave differently? That's one thing. The other thing that is in conversation are the changes in hormones throughout the menstrual cycle. So just summarizing super quickly the menstrual cycle, we have 4 phases. So the initial phase is the early follicular, which is basically from the day 1 of our period, in which both estrogen and progesterone concentrations are very low. The second phase, which is late follicular, estrogen rises, but progesterone remains pretty low. This is followed by the ovulation, and then the end, or the 4th phase, which is the tricky one for thermoregulation purposes, is the luteal phase, or phase 4. Progesterone increases and estrogen is moderate. That increase in progesterone means that core temperature, the internal core temperature, increases as well. We're talking about 0.3, 0.7 degrees Celsius, which is maintained throughout the entire phase. So imagine you being a female in this menstrual cycle phase, in which you are starting an exercise already at a higher core body temperature. So there are several theories that says, yes, females are more at risk, especially during this luteal phase, or the phase 4 of the menstrual cycle. But, and I'm just giving you a couple of hints here, I'm not talking about it much, some studies that have been conducted in sodium hypohydration and pre-cooling doesn't show a compromise in performance during this phase. So let's just say that our body are so finely tuned that it's able to kind of compensate this additional increase in core body temperature in a way that does not necessarily affect performance in the long term, okay? But that's like a theory. The other thing that we have, or the other difference between males and females, is that females tend to have less sweat glands, which means that we produce less sweat in comparison to males. So if we are in the same environment producing the same amount of heat, if we control by heat, females tend to sweat a little bit less than males. But at the end of the day, it does not necessarily work that way, because if we're both in the same space, we not necessarily produce the same heat while doing the same exercise. To put another one into the list of potential differences, females tend to feel hotter. Like if you're in a hot environment, we tend to feel this increase in temperature as a more disturbing sensation. So we tend to reduce our exercise, let's say like the intensity of the exercise first, to try to compensate with that, just because we don't feel the same. So again, there are definitely differences, but if these differences do affect performance on the long term, that's what we probably need to keep asking and keep researching.
How do we measure heat and its influence on the human body?
Okay, so that's in the lab is pretty easy. In the outside world, that's a different story. So we have limited resources in the outside world. So in the lab, for example, we tend to have different methods to measure core body temperature. So you could use, for example, gastrointestinal temperature using like a probe that comes from the nose towards the stomach. You could also do the same, but all the other way. So measuring rectal temperature. You could also ingest a pill, which also measures your internal temperature. But in real life, you won't be using either probes or pills on day-to-day living, right? So that's not applicable for day-to-day living. Heart rate, in the other hand, it doesn't measure, obviously, temperature. It measures beats per minute. But we know that when we are like overheated, our heart rate increases. So that's something that you can monitor to see if you are compensating the heat by hydrating properly, for example, or trying to cool yourself down.
Are there any hard numbers that above this heartbeat you should stop exercising, or are there any numbers that are dangerous or we should be monitoring and be
I really need to research a little bit more on that, but coming from the fact that heart rate is a very individual response, and that heart rate also, so you kind of train your heart rate, so you know yourself a little bit better. So if you know that your heart rate is going way over what you usually expect, or if you are feeling puffed and tired and like a different mix of things, maybe would stop regardless of what the number is. But again, I have had colleagues that train in the heat, like on purpose in preparation, and heart rate goes above 200, 220 easily, and they're still exercising. So I'm not saying that you need to go to those levels at all, but the responses are very individual. And because of that, you need to be aware of your normal heart rates at different zones and be able to say, yeah, this is definitely not what I would expect for me in this particular training zone, for example. But yeah, going back to how to measure these things, you could also use perceptual measures. So you could use the rate of perceived exertion. So basically it's a scale that goes from 6 to 20, in which 6 is as we are now, like not exercise at all, just resting. And then that scale goes up to 20, which is your maximal exertion, in which you can't basically run any longer or perform the activity any longer because you are completely exhausted. So basically anything above 16, we know is very intense. And if you are feeling like, let's say within that range, 16 to 20 in the scale, but you are not meant to be training that high, that's already an indication that you are probably a little bit too hot or fatiguing because of the temperature. And the last one that I will probably mention would be thermal sensation. So let's assume that we have a scale similar to this one that I'm mentioning that goes, in this case, from 0 to 8. So 0 is extremely cold, but 8 is extremely hot. So if you have more than two readings going above 7.5, one after the other, you may say this is definitely an exercise that we shouldn't be pursuing any longer because it's too hot for your athlete, regardless of the type of exercise that they're doing.
I have a question about the scale. So does the athlete rate how hot they feel in them or how hot the environment feels?
Now, how hot you feel in that moment. So if it is not tolerable, really hot, etc., etc., etc. So it's a perceptual kind of thing. So you may be running at 32 degrees Celsius, for example, but at a very, very high humidity, you may not be able to continue just because you feel within a 6 to 20 too hot, let's say a 19, for example. So it's obviously will be influenced by an external temperature, like ambient conditions, but it's not that what we're measuring. For that, you measure other things. You measure the temperature, obviously, the humidity, you measure the wet bulb glove, and some other things that takes into consideration radiation and all other variables. But for that, all the different institutions, let's say, have their own guidelines, and based on certain parameters, you need to stop exercise regardless of how you feel. It's for security purposes, I guess.
Well, I think these apply very well to team sports and maybe running events and so on. But with weightlifting, you just have individuals coming to the gym doing the session. So all CrossFitters, powerlifters, they come in, do their session, and they kind of have to decide for themselves whether it's a good day to cut the training short or they should push through and finish. So I think having the scale, writing yourself every now and then how hard you feel you're working, so how exerted you are, and maybe how hot you feel, that may give you a better indication on what is going on now with me and how I should make decisions about continuing versus calling it a day or doing something to bring the temperature down to feel a little bit less hot.
Yes, and that will change because, again, it's perceptual. So it all depends. Let's say that we're talking about female weightlifter. It may be that early in the follicular phase, they can tolerate heat a little bit more, but then in the luteal phase, they feel hotter quicker, in which case they may want to stop at an earlier stage rather than keep pushing for a little bit longer, right? So that's why it's an individual perceptual scale, and it doesn't work the same for everybody. You just basically need to understand how it works, understand your body, and then decide how to apply it like in the long term and see how that works.
Are we ready to go into the prevention strategies? So how to mitigate the heat?
To mitigate heat, I need to explain something first. We have two approaches. Long-term approach, which is what we call heat acclimation or heat acclimatization, depending if it's an artificial environment or not, which takes a few days or weeks of preparation in advance to competing in the heat. This is proven that it helps reduce heart rate, it helps with thermoregulation, it helps with sweat rates, etc., etc. So it is proven that this constant exposure to heat and particularly exercising in the heat reaches and achieves that. But the thing is that this method can be a little bit expensive. Not everybody has access to heat chambers. Not everybody has the time. And the other thing with heat acclimatization or acclimation is that you sometimes need to modify your training to get it to work. So athletes do not necessarily have the time or the willingness to modify their exercise sessions for that to work. So we move them towards other strategies that are applied in the short term, which is what we call the acute heat mitigation strategies. And within this, we have like several categories. We have those that are applied before the exercise, those that are applied during exercise, and the ones that are applied in combination. So before and during the exercise, or even like mixed methods. So a mix of the two, okay? So, or more than one method. So having that in mind, what we can say, we have strategies in preparation too, which include, for example, sodium hypohydration. So basically what you do, you increase your plasma volume by having an osmotically active ingredient. It could be sodium or it could be glycerol, could be any of these plasma enhancers. And then basically you start exercising well hydrated or more hydrated than usual. And then that delays the onset of fatigue, right? But then we have also others that are what we call pre-cooling. So we have, for example, ice slurries that you can drink, like let's just call it like a slushy or just like broken ice, let's say. So that's the one. We have also ice vests, which is just basically a vest with ice packs, but you could also have less fancy ones. So for example, cooling towels. So towels that you put in a esky with ice, and then you just chuck that towel on top of you. And you have fans. I don't know if you have noticed in the like tennis that they use the cooling towels or the ice vest with a fan just next to them during the breaks. Those are all, well, in that case is per cooling, so during exercise, but you can do that before exercise. And you have also others like cold water immersion, for example, but that means that you need to go into ice bath, which takes more time, and then your muscles may cool too much, and then that could make things a little bit harder, like to start exercising at those lower temperatures. And then basically the same methods you can apply during or a combination of the two. And then as recovery, there are other methods that can be applied as well afterwards. So the purpose of this is, if it's applied externally, like a cooling vest, is to try to reduce the skin temperature so you can dissipate the heat through your skin. So it's like you're favoring that gradient towards the skin so you can dissipate the heat easier. And if you are drinking it, for example, the internal methods like the ice slurry, basically your core body temperature is dropping and you're also helping to that heat dissipation as well. So basically that's more or less the mechanism and the different strategies that are available. There are others that are more perceptual. So for example, the use of menthol. You can apply menthol externally, but it doesn't affect either the skin temperature or the core body temperature. It's basically a feeling of being cooler. But yeah, so that's a very quick summary of the potential strategies that can be used.
So in terms of the preventive strategies and the in-training strategies, we had fans, drinking cold liquids, putting a vest or putting a cold towel around the neck, or doesn't matter where we put it, where the ice should go.
Yeah, so the first thing that you need to try to do out of all of those strategies is to maintain good hydration status. So the most important one is always hydration. After that, the biggest exposure area or the bigger the exposure area, the better. So if we're talking about, for example, cooling towels, you should probably try to aim for the neck, but also the top, the thighs. You could also wear an ice vest plus the cooling towels and a mix of them. So it all depends as well on the type of exercise. How long have you been exposed to the heat? How hot you are, obviously, and how long is the break? So in tennis, for example, you can do that. You can wear an ice vest or you can have a cooling towel. In soccer, you can do the same because you have those 15 minutes break in between the two halves. In the gym, you can easily do that as well if you are pacing yourself like between exercises, I guess. But again, if you are, for example, in a marathon, you can't do that. So you can maybe prepare before the event, and then during the event, you need to just guarantee hydration and maybe just cooling by ingesting cold beverages. If you have a slurry, by all means, but you need to also take into account that slurries or very cold beverage may cause some gastrointestinal upsets if you are not used to it. So you need to try to balance all the things and see how that goes. I don't know if you have seen, for example, the headbands that have been used lately. These headbands, basically what they do, they just reduce the thermal perception at the forehead. So it's not actually cooling you down, but it makes you feel a little bit cooler. So if that helps, even if it is a placebo effect, by all means, but definitely things that will help you the most will be pouring water on top of you or on top of your head or at the neck level, or drinking cooler beverages as well.
All right. So could we go now through pre-hydration, hydration during, and maybe rehydration after the training? Because you say this is the most important. So what we can do before, during, and after?
Okay, so it all depends again on the event and the type of exercise that you're doing. But basically what you will try to do is to arrive to your event as well hydrated as possible. So things that you could do on the day-to-day basis will be to check the color of your urine. So the clearer it is, the better hydrated you are. If your urine is like very yellow or towards the orange side of it, you are already dehydrated. So you need to be mindful of that and start drinking from the moment you wake up and maintain constant drinking habits throughout the day. However, let's assume that you are in a very hot environment or that you have been exercising for several days and you haven't had enough time to actually replenish or all those losses. You could use other strategies to try to retain that liquid. Because I don't know if you have noticed that when you drink just plain water, if you drink too much, you tend to go to the toilet quite a lot to get rid of that excess water. But if you add some electrolytes to that liquid, you may retain some of that volume, like water volume. Instead of peeing all the time, you basically maintain some of that volume within your body, which rehydrates you even quicker. So adding electrolytes to that prehydration fluid is important, but also to prepare for long events, you can use something called hyperhydration. So I mentioned that before, either by using glycerol, for example, or in my case, which is like one of my research areas, would be to use sodium hyperhydration, so table salt to hyperhydrate. So we're talking about, this is very roughly because the recommendations is based on individual body compositions, but let's say roughly around 10 to 11 grams of table salt divided in 4 doses, for example, with 30 mils or so per kilogram of body mass, so divided in 4 as well, throughout an hour or so. You can consume that throughout an hour, and within a 2-hour period, you will be hyperhydrated. So you will be peeing a little bit for the first hour, but after that, that liquid will be retained. And as I said before, you will be that big pot with more water that will take a little bit more time to boil, right? So that's probably some of the things that you can do beforehand to prepare for a race or a competition, or like, let's say, a CrossFit comp that takes a little bit of time. During the actual competition, you need to try to maintain well hydrated. I would probably suggest knowing your individual losses. So basically do like a sweat test in advance to know how much liquid you're actually losing within an hour, and also how much sodium you're losing as well. So you know if you need to replenish or not your electrolytes as well. And most of the time, the longer the event, the more electrolytes you actually need to replenish. So plain water won't do the trick. So if it is a short session, 60 minutes or so, plain water will do. Anything above 60 minutes, you will probably need to include electrolytes into the equation. And this is just me without touching, carbohydrate needs or anything like that, but just talking about fluid intake. And then ideally, if it is too hot, that fluid within the exercise should be cold. Or if you have access to ice slurry, go with ice slurry as well, because that will help you drop that core body temperature as well and will help you feel less fatigue in the long term. But again, knowing your individual responses, because if you then will have gut issues, you may not be able to finish whatever activity you're doing just because you're not feeling your best. And then obviously afterwards, you are trying, because you are meant to know already how much fluid you have lost, you will need to aim to replenish 100 or 50% of those losses, because again, you will pee part of that fluid intake afterwards. So to try to maintain that hydration balance is important, and that's why you need to drink a little bit more at the very end. But at the end, it doesn't matter as much if it has too many electrolytes or not, or if it's cold or not. It's basically just to try to replenish your losses, and then obviously keep in mind that you also need to replenish carbohydrate and protein and all the other macronutrients that are relevant for every athlete.
Okay. Do we have any other strategies you haven't mentioned yet for after the exposure to heat to recover, I guess?
Yeah, so for the after exposure to heat, basically is basically the same thing. What you want to try to do is to try to drop your core body temperature, but you also have different interests. You want to drop your core body temperature, but you also want to recover quicker. So basically what we tend to recommend is cold water immersion for afterwards, but obviously hydration again will be probably the most important thing. The important thing, I guess, of all these acute heat mitigation strategies is first to know which one will work the best for certain scenarios and which one do you like the most, because not necessarily all of them improve performance, but that doesn't mean that they won't help you to feel better. So at the end of the day, if you're feeling better, you will probably perform better, but do not necessarily mean because the acute heat mitigation strategy is causing that improvement in performance. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's just because feeling better and then you can do your best, but it's not like a direct link, like without the cooling vest, I won't be like a fast runner. No, it's not. That's not the link that I'm looking for. It's basically just recommend all these strategies. Not all of them work. For example, in females, in that review that we conducted, only a few work. So the combination between ice slurry and ice vest, pre-exercise or pre and per, so during the break as well, it did help. The use of ice vest help and improve running performance in a 10-kilometer time trial. Sodium hypohydration improve exercise capacity. So they were able to cycle for longer. This is in females, right? But again, research is very mixed and not necessarily well controlled. So I think probably the take-home message will be try these strategies yourself, see which one suits you the best and which one aligns more with your budget, with your time, with your commitment and your demands. You basically mentioned before, well, when you're doing weightlifting, we don't have like air conditioning, for example. So in that case, bringing a fan may help and keep the doors open so there is air circulation to maintain all your athletes well hydrated. That's probably another way that I will do. Provide some water, cool water as well. If they have breaks, which obviously depending on the of the event, if it's a CrossFit competition, for example, breaks may be, very timed, let's say, but they are available breaks. Say with training, in those breaks, then try to cool them down with other strategies. It could be a spray of water or it could be vest if they're available. I think it would all depend on how much heat do you generate. And as I said before, the alternatives you have, like you will never go and if it's hot, train with a jumper on. So try to use light clothes as well, might be a strategy to use in those environments.
Are there any modalities you found that people are using or promoting in the real world, but there's no research to back them up, or the research is saying now they don't work?
Well, like in reality, so this is what happens. In males, many of these strategies seem to work, but the research that has been conducted in males has certain limitations. So for example, most of them do not have airflow within their protocols, which means that the use of these heat mitigation strategies may, like the response of these heat mitigation strategies may be a little bit more exaggerated. Like, oh yes, I felt really good, just because by not having airflow, you feel that this is actually cooling you quite a lot. So again, there are limitations. But I guess at the end of the day, if we're talking about pre-cooling, for example, before exercise, if it is a short session, let's say maximum 30 minutes or so, or less than 40 minutes, you may be able to see improvements regardless of what exercise it is. It could be, but ideally, or at least the ones that I have been studying, is like continuous exercise, like aerobic, repetitive exercise. If we're talking about longer periods of time, more than an hour, and you're saying that an ice vest actually works for those periods of time, maybe not, because the effect of the ice vest is most of the time not more than 15 to 20 minutes. Again, depending on how much heat you're actually producing. If you're recommending, for example, the headbands that I was mentioning before to improve marathon pace, that's definitely it's not realistic. Like physiologically, it is probably not I think it's more marketing than another thing, I guess. Let's just be polite and say that. But yeah, basically what you're trying to do is to try to tailor for internal and external methods together, and large surface areas should try to see the best of the benefits. Yeah, go for it.
So with surface areas, core more important than limbs, or head is more important, where if we have one towel and it's not too big, what should we cover for the best outcome?
I'll probably go with with the neck for that, because it helps you with thermal sensation, and it also like reduces the temperature quite quicker. So imagine you in a situation in which you're actually really hot, you're sweating, like you feel like a headache just because you're too hot. By cooling down the neck, definitely that will help and will soothe not just the sensation but also the temperature. If you're aiming, for example, for thighs, which is a long surface area, but then you need to do, I don't know, a deep squat or many squats one after the other, if you cool down the thighs, maybe you won't be able to perform as you should. So again, these are at the moment very general recommendations that you need to practice individually and say, yes, this works for me, or no, it doesn't. But if I could pick one, I would probably go with neck for cooling.
Awesome, thank you. Anything to add about rehydration? Because you said a few times it's important to rehydrate properly. So I guess I would like you to maybe clarify what properly means.
Okay, so for rehydration, you have several things to account for. Your losses, which you can easily you can calculate that very easily. Like, it's not the best equation, the one that I'm going to share with you, but you can kind of have a rough idea. So if you weigh yourself before and after an exercise session and you know how much did you drink, but let's say that you didn't drink anything, and you weigh yourself before and after and you lost 2 kilos, you can't assume that those 2 kilos are equivalent to 2 liters of sweat, in which case you will need to rehydrate with at least 2 liters. The problem, as I was saying before, is that when you rehydrate with the same amount of fluid that you actually lost, some of that fluid will be lost as urine. So what you need to try to do is to instead of having 2 liters, drink 3 liters, which is 150% of your losses, and then that will make you retain the fluid as close as possible to those 2 liters that you actually lost. However, if you are really, really dehydrated, you have lost too much sweat, you could also add some electrolytes into that equation. But also importantly, depending on when is your next training session or your next competition, you need to add other things to that as well, like enough carbohydrate or proteins, because again, like if you are dehydrated but again you're under fuel, like at the end of the day you won't be able to perform either in competition or in your next session the same way. So that's what I mean with rehydrate appropriately. So plain water most of the time do not work unless it is enough in quantity. But again, if you are mixing that with fuel, like with proteins, with carbohydrate, a little bit of added salt maybe to the food, etc., then that's what we call appropriate rehydrate.
So how long, let's say with the scenario the athlete lost 2 liters of water during their training session, now they can drink 3 liters of water and have a meal after the training, how long it will take for the body to be back to, let's say, the basal state?
It all depends, and it depends on what do you use for rehydration, as I said before, and also as well, like if you're adding the electrolytes or not. There are some studies that have focused on the use of beers, for example, for rehydration, and then athletes tend to be rehydrated in the first hour, but then by the 4-hour time point, they're as dehydrated or even more dehydrated than by the moment they finish the actual activity. Okay, so depending on what you drink, it could take 2 hours, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, or even the entire day. So again, if you drink, for example, the 3 liters within 30 minutes, that will mean that part of that fluid will be urinated very quickly afterwards. So you need to kind of pace yourself and check, like, okay, how am I feeling? Like, how dark is my urine? Am I thirsty still? So those signals need to be taken care of. And if you are thirsty, drink a little bit more. If the urine is still yellowish, drink a little bit more. So on and so forth until that equilibrium is reached. So I suppose that is like a very individual response as well, but most of the time can be achieved if properly done by the 3-hour mark or so.
How the electrolytes will influence this timeline?
Electrolytes will help you retain some of that water as well. But again, you need to try to take into account how much electrolyte you have been taking also beforehand, and if you're sick of the flavor, etc., etc. So most of the time, unless dehydration is very severe, I wouldn't recommend, not because it's gonna do anything like harmful or anything, but I wouldn't recommend electrolytes if you can actually add the salt or mix that rehydration with the fueling afterwards, because food in general has sodium, and that sodium will help you retain that water. So if you have a nice recovery plan that includes your carbs, your proteins, your fluids, etc., you may not need the electrolytes. If you don't have anything but sport beverages, we'll go with that because it has electrolytes and it also has the carbohydrate that you may need for rehydration and for recovery recovery in the short term. But eventually you will need to eat. So
okay, one last scenario is what happens in weightlifting is a weight class contested sport. So athletes are divided into divisions on the base of their body weight.
yes.
Now the weigh-in is 2 hours before the competition starts. So what some athletes will do, they will reduce body weight, then they weigh in, then they have 2 hours to bring themselves to the best competitive condition. Some of the athletes will go as far as dehydration to get themselves under the cutoff point of the body weight class. And now they have 2 hours to rehydrate themselves successfully. How do you see that?
Yes, so it's interesting because I have very shortly, I have worked with martial arts before, and I have seen athletes going like underneath the mat and staying underneath the mat just to sweat as much as they can before weighing in. And same with weighing, all these plastic suits and stuff, just, drop that extra weight. So the ideal scenario would be to do this gradually over time, not dehydrate yourself gradually, just to drop the excess weight gradually over time. We know that doesn't happen all the time, and then we need to sometimes cut that weight very close to the weighing in, and dehydration seems to be one of the alternatives. When that happens, you need to definitely try to rehydrate as quick as you can as soon as you weigh in, and for that I will probably say hyperhydration is the way to go, just because you need to retain that excess liquid that you're drinking. So if you just drink water, as I said before, if you drink only water, you will pee and urinate that excess, and you won't be able to retain that. So what you probably need to do in that case is add sodium, for example, or glycerol, but I'll talk about sodium because it's what I use. And you know that with this protocol that I mentioned before, roughly 10 or so grams of sodium with 30 mils of liquid per kilogram of lean mass. That's probably around, let's just do a practical recommendation here. It will be roughly 3 to 4 grams of sodium with around like 300 cc of water, and that divided in 4 doses in the first hour. So when you do that, basically what you do is you retain all that liquid. You will urinate, but you retain most of it. And if you add carbohydrate to that mix, you will also retain a little bit more, because glycogen tends to absorb a little bit of water, which means that will help you rehydrate and fuel yourself properly before the match or the competition. But it's definitely something that has to be done, has to be prepared by a sports dietitian. I wouldn't recommend doing this without guidance, and also has to definitely involve electrolytes, because without electrolytes you won't be able to get this retention that you're looking for in that short period of time. It's doable, but definitely probably not the best way to go.
Yeah, of course. Do you have any final advice for coaches and athletes who will exercise in heat?
Well, probably the first and most important one will be to try to provide for this heat acclimatization or acclimation as much as possible. So even if it is with simple strategies like saunas or water immersion, but trying to exercise in advance in the heat or in similar conditions, because in the long term, that will definitely provide the most heat adaptation for your athletes. That will probably be the first one to go. The other one that I would probably say is to try to keep the cooling method simple, but work with them in advance to see which ones are the most suitable for each of your athletes. And at this point, I'm not saying for males, these ones are the ones that work. For females, these are the one that works, because I think within athletes, everybody is unique. So everybody has their own preferences, and then we're more sensitive to some methods than other methods, and we may just prefer one over the other. So I would probably say try, see how that goes, hear your athletes, see what they want to say, but try to obviously find the more reputable resources like peer review articles, or just go and ask if you don't know exactly where to go, to inform your athletes into those strategies that do work, or if they don't work exactly, but they are promising, just try those individually and say okay, this is a protocol that it's suggested. Let's see how that goes in advance. Never for the first time during the race, in advance. But yeah, that's something that has to be individualized as everything, I guess, with athletes.
Awesome. That's very helpful. Okay, 2 last questions to finish. The first one is, what is your favorite color?
That's easy. Green.
All right. Any specific green?
I think I love all shades of green, but probably bright green is my favorite. I don't know why.
And I love green it is.
Okay, so let's...
Where people can find you.
Okay, so I am in social media. It's pretty easy. It's basically my name and last name, so Lilia Convit. That's for Instagram and X. And also in different areas of research, you can find me as the anthropometry lab or the sweat scientist. But basically, through Lilia Convit, you can nail the others.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lilia. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure as well. Thank you, Alex.